We'll start today by thinking about what identity can be. That is, how do we define ourselves, others, and various groups? Questions of identity are generally quite complicated, and as is often the case, the very concept itself is slippery and nearly impossible to pin down. Suffice to say, there are many kinds of identity. Here are a few key terms that we'll need in order to think about political identity. These are terms that sometimes are used differently in everyday language than how they are used in social science. First, we have class, which many analysts call socioeconomic status. As that term shows, class is not just an economic attribute, but also has to do with social standing. Thus, class consists of more than just level of income or wealth. It also has to do with the level of education, with a person's occupation, and even with subtle cultural aspects, such as where a person lives and the kind of accent that person speaks with. Next, we have race and ethnicity, which are often used interchangeably, but really mean different things. Race tends to refer to physical characteristics that are passed down through heredity. Of course, the main factor here tends to be skin pigmentation. Ethnicity has less to do with physical characteristics and more to do with some sort of shared understanding the members of that group hold, which may be based on culture, language, religion, territory, and a shared history. Finally, we come to a nation, which you will recall is a group of people with a perceived sameness, much the same way as an ethnic group is. Most distinguish between ethnic groups and nations, however, based upon whether they see themselves as part of another political entity, in the case of an ethnic group, or if they want some sort of political autonomy or self-determination, such as is the case with nations. Thus, nations are often characterized by nationalistic sentiments, or a desire to have their own state. These definitions are pretty rough, and there is obviously some overlap. The notion of ethnicity in particular is tricky because it bleeds into the others, such that classes and nations often have ethnic undertones. Still, these distinctions will help us think about identity politics with greater clarity. So what kind of identities are most important? As we so often do, we'll start with some theorizing from two 19th century German thinkers, our old friends Karl Marx and Max Weber. Marx, of Communist Manifesto fame, saw identity as predominantly economic. Remember, in his view of human development, the economic basis of society really determined that society's entire makeup, both political and cultural. With the advent of industrialization, Marx saw identity as a rough dichotomy between workers, or the proletariat, and owners, or the bourgeoisie. Indeed, he believed that following industrialization, all other sorts of distinctions would pretty much fade into the background, which is why he believed that the workers of the world would really unite in a common struggle against the bourgeoisie, who in his view used their system of capitalist democracy to oppress the workers. Marx believed that industrialization would endow workers with class consciousness, or a shared perception of their common fate. It is not really accurate to call the more recent protests against socioeconomic inequality in much of the Western world Marxist, as most of these protesters would like to hang on to democracy for certain, and most of the capitalist system as well. Still, there is a sense that these protesters share some of the same notions of a class consciousness and a shared identity as to being the low man on the totem pole that Marx describes in his work. Max Weber also thought a great deal about identity and came up with a much broader characterization of the term. He believed that the most important identities we hold are cultural, and he spent a great deal of his career writing about the way various cultural traits affect society, politics, and the economy. Indeed, one of the most famous contributions is the idea of a Protestant work ethic, which is the idea that there is something about the culture of Protestant Christianity that promotes delayed gratification and thus the success in capitalistic endeavors. His conceptualization of identity is much broader than the economic worker-owner dichotomy Marx proposes. Of course, identity is an extremely multifaceted concept, and both theorists are partly correct. Identity can be both economic and cultural, and it can be many other factors as well.